Yeah.
So this morning, I am chatting today with royal historian, journalist, and author Robert Hardman. Robert's recently published book, Charles III, is being described as a brilliant account of the turbulent period in British history that many believe will become a historical document. Robert, thank you so much for sparing the time to chat today, because I know you're busy. Um,
Pleasure, Kanda. Hello.
Hello. Well, thank you. So tell me, what inspired you to write a book about Charles III?
I had very recently finished a biography, a big biography of Queen Elizabeth II, and I had promised my wife I would not do any more books for quite a long time because they're quite time consuming. Particularly when you're fitting them in around a day job, and I work for a newspaper, and I also write tele-documentaries. So I wasn't planning to write one, and then obviously we had the sad news of the Queen's death, and suddenly, the royal landscape shifted completely, and I realised that it was time. Clearly, it was going to be a moment in history, and that this should be captured, certainly in documentary form, and so set about writing and making a film about this sort of period of transition. A lot of other people were trying to do the same thing. Fortunately, the proposal that I and others made to the palace, they decided to go with us. And then, having embarked on that, I thought, well, actually, really ought to do a book. So rather gingerly informed my wife that actually there is one more book. Wasn't very happy, but as a journalist, as a historian, these are really big moments. I mean, if you look at the sort of the royal story, is really the sort of the almost like the punctuation of our history. We talk about the Victorian era, the Edwardians, Georgians, whatever. Monarchy does, in many ways, set the sort of parameters of how we look at our own times. So I felt I'm going to write a book, and I have.
Brilliant, brilliant. Well, how do you go about the research process for delving into King Charles's life and character?
Well, there been a very good official biography of him by Jonathan Dimbleby back in the mid-90s. That was alongside a documentary as well. I wasn't setting out to do an authorized book. I mean, that would take many years of research, and this was going to be a portrait of the transition, if you like, of his first year or so as king, but obviously rewind a bit into his life. I mean, you've got to put him in context. But I wasn't going to be going through kind of school reports from Gordonston and every aspect of his naval career, because the nub of this was going to be the dawn of the reign of Charles III. And so I talked to people. I talked to as many people as I could in and around his inner circle, his staff, former staff. Along the way, I was lucky enough to interview sort of members of his family. So the Princess Royal was brilliant, and talked to Queen Camilla's sister. As we got sort of into the coronation, through the coronation, out the other side of the coronation, a fairly extensive cast of characters began to take shape, from the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Dean of Westminster, all the sort of people involved in the coronation. Obviously, all those who've been involved in and around the funeral of Elizabeth II. And inevitably, when you have a period of transition, you're trying to talk to as many people who are sort of affected by it, and what I think some people tend to forget now. But I mean, that the same week we changed our head of state, we changed our head of government. So I was able to get the first interview with Liz Truss, her sort of reflections on her very short premiership as well, which
Yeah.
which all bound up. I mean, frankly, the main element of her time as prime minister was dealing with the change of reign. So and then on top of all that, as many files and documents and archives and everything as I could get my hands on. So it was conducted at some speed, because it needed to be out really not much more than a year after the publishers wanted to get it out, after a year into the new reign. So it was a busy year.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. It was lightning speed. You got that out. Amazing. In what ways do you believe King Charles's upbringing and experiences have shaped his perspective on the monarchy?
Well, I think he's a really interesting subject as a royal biographer, because he's really the first one in a long time who was born to be king. I mean, when you think about it, his mother was not born to be queen. I mean, she obviously from a relatively young age, it was pretty likely she was going to be queen, but she wasn't born to be queen. Her father wasn't born to be king. His father wasn't born to be king either. So in his case, right from the start, he was destined for the role of the Princess Royal. Was quite funny. She said that when they were growing up, the nanny would always refer to her brother as the future monarch. She said, sort of rather put her in her place. And I think that there was a lot of pressure. He was a very sort of groundbreaking, or he remains a very groundbreaking monarch, because it was a different upbringing to all his predecessors. He's the first monarch who's actually been to a normal school, relatively normal. I mean, obviously public school, but been to school, who's had to pass his own exams. He hasn't had preferential treatment all the way through. Of course, he's had immense privilege and all the rest that goes with being the heir to the throne. But I mean, he had to, his A levels were his own. His Cambridge entry exam was his own. He didn't progress immediately up through the ranks of the Navy, because he struggled to pass the one of the navigation exams you have to pass. So he's, if you could put it like this, the sort of the most normal monarch, the monarch who sort of, as it were, had the most familiar life experiences to his subjects, and yet through it all, he is conscious all the time of his destiny. I mean, there was an extraordinary dinner at Buckingham Palace in the 60s, where it was in the late 60s, where it was decided, that where he was going to go to university, what he was going to read, what he was going to do after university, which are the forces he was going to go to. And this dinner, included the Prime Minister and the Archbishop of Canterbury and family members, and it included pretty much everybody except Prince Charles. He was just sort of informed afterwards. By the way, this is what you're going to do. I mean, he only learned he was Prince of Wales when it was announced on TV, and he's sort of sitting there watching the closing ceremony of the Commonwealth Games in Cardiff with all his classmates at prep school, and at the end, the Duke of Edinburgh says, and reading out a message from the Queen. And Prince Charles is going to be Prince of Wales, and that's sort of suddenly announced in front of everybody else. Yeah, it's a very odd upbringing, but on the other hand, it's less odd than that of his predecessors.
Yeah, yeah. And what do you think sort of sets your biography apart from other works about King Charles and the British monarchy?
I think it's a very contemporary account, and it's the first insider account. I mean, I call it Charles III, the inside story, because it is the inside story of him becoming king and how he approached it, how it happened. I mean, the events of that week in September 2022, where on the one moment you've got that famous picture of a very smiley, happy, rather proud Elizabeth II, who's just appointed a new prime minister because the country needs a new prime minister. She knows that. She's been determined to do this properly. And within the space of 3 days, she's gone. Yeah. And I don't think people quite appreciate the speed of her decline. I mean, it caught everybody by surprise, including obviously the family, which is why so few of them actually made it to Balmoral in time. And you've got to, it just always occurs to me in many countries in the world, if you did change your head of state and your head of government in the space of 3 days, that would be a recipe for instability. I mean, we managed to do that without without a demo, without a crossword, no shots being fired. It does, I think, go to the heart of actually the stability and continuity that monarchy engenders. And we don't think about it very much, but I think it was a lesson in why it's a system that we are lucky to have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And were there any challenges you faced while writing the biography, especially sort of given the sensitivity of it all?
Well, I mean, you always want to know more as a
Yeah,
historian, as a journalist. I mean, you're always, every closed door you want to open it. And yeah, there were areas and elements of what I was trying to find out that I just wasn't going to find out. I did my best. I was lucky the king himself, he didn't give me an interview. I interviewed him a number of times before for various TV documentaries that I've made over the years, and I've always thoroughly enjoyed talking to him. I actually made a film about him for his 60th birthday and spent quite a long time wandering around Highgrove and Birkhall with him. So I had a pretty good understanding of the kind of man he is. But I'd always found him very guarded on anything to do with his own plans and thoughts about what he would do as monarch. And I wasn't alone. I mean, it was interesting writing the books. Is that was a recurring theme, even from those who work for him or have worked for him, those who work around him, ministers in Whitehall. They would all say, he would not he didn't enjoy having any sort of discussions on what sort of a monarch he was going to be, what he was going to do when he took charge. Precisely, I think, because he felt that was inappropriate, that was disrespectful to his mother while she was alive, and it would effectively undermine her position as queen. And I think history will look back at her reign and the fact that her authority was completely undiminished right to the very end. She was E2R, she was in charge. No one was saying that it's time. I mean, you get the odd article here and there, but there was no clamour for her to sort of step aside or make way for her son and heir. And I think that's as much down to him as to her, because he didn't foment that debate. He didn't, he might be a plot line in The Crown. And I don't know whether you've seen all the episodes of The Crown. I mean, I've had to for professional reasons, and I take issue with a lot of it, and particularly this sort of theme that comes through, that you've got a sort of restless Prince of Wales, impatient to take this on, and it's absolutely not what happened. He was absolutely, and as he said to several people I spoke to, he said, I didn't want this to happen a day before it did. He's quite stoical. This
yeah.
was one for the Almighty, not for him to call.
Mm. And what aspects of King Charles's life and reign do you find most fascinating or compelling to explore?
I mean, I find I just find that sort of sudden transition, that moment. I mean, I found it very moving, actually. Just the moment he discovers he's king. He's literally at the wheel of a borrowed Land Rover. He's driving at some speed across the Balmoral estate from Birkhall to get back to the castle, because the Queen has suddenly really taken a turn for the worse. And the phone rings. Well, not his phone, but one of the party in the back of the car can see that this is the palace switchboard trying to get hold of them, and answers it and passes the phone to his private secretary, who says, "Sir, I think you're going to have to pull over." And that's the point he learns he's king. I mean, that's an extraordinary moment. We all know, history records that Elizabeth II became monarch while she was in the branches of a giant fig tree in Aberdare National Park in Kenya. And Charles III became king, or learned he'd become king, while he was, driving through the Highlands. The Highlands he's always loved. So it's sort of appropriate, I think, that it should happen there. But I mean, still that incredibly powerful moment, and yet it's it's sort of humdrum. He's at the wheel of a car, and it's sort of, well, okay, I'll be with you in a minute. Let's put
Yeah,
the car
yeah,
in gear and carry on driving. Um, I just find always it's often it's the small things in these stories that stick in the mind. I mean, talking to the people that around him who work with him, members of his family. Um, what struck the Princess Royal? She said it was really interesting. She talked about sort of the sense of relief when she watched the crown being removed from her mother's coffin. When it comes off and it's sort of put on the altar in St George's Chapel. And she just said there was a sort of sense. She said it was weird, but a sort of sense of relief. That's
yeah,
it. It's over.
yeah.
And the little things like the so many members of staff talked about, in all the chaos and mayhem and all the sort of frantic decision making going on in those days immediately after the death of the Queen. The thing that hit a lot of them was flying back down when they came back down to London, and they're coming in behind the coffin on the A40 from Northolt, and there are all these huge posters of the Queen, and it's the fact it's got her dates. It says 1926 to 2022. It's the addition of the date, sort of closure. For them, for a lot of people, that just sort of suddenly hit home. Or I mean, Princess Anne again. I mean, she said one of the things that sticks in her mind was he accompanied the coffin down through Scotland, from Balmoral down to Edinburgh, and the fact that all the pony clubs had turned out with their perfectly fitted maids. She said, and she's a countrywoman. I mean, she gets the effort that goes into turning out a very smart looking pony on
Mm.
on a Sunday morning. Those are the things that actually people in the household, people in the family, I think members of the public, they'll remember as much as the sort of the big stuff like this, sort of the proclamation or the,
Yes.
the Privy Council or even the crowning in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, yeah. And how do you navigate the balance sort of between providing a comprehensive portrait of King Charles, but also sort of respecting his privacy, and the monarchy's traditions?
Yeah, it's a balance. I mean, as I say, as a journalist, a historian, you want to know as much as you can, but there are always going to be boundaries, and one or two people would say things, and on condition that they remain. I mean, there are things that are not in the book simply because people have sworn me to secrecy, and
Yes.
that they obviously I respect that. You just hope that at the end of it, people feel they've gleaned stuff that they didn't know, and and that the people involved. I mean, there are things in there that I know they wish weren't in there. But I mean, no one's turned around and said that's wrong. So
No.
far, they
No.
haven't anyway.
Yeah. So, I mean, how did you find out about the late Queen being angered at the Sussexes' decision to call their daughter Lilibet?
Well, that's an interesting one. Actually, I was very interested at the response to that. I mean, it's not a very extensive part of the book. I mean, I think that whole Lilibet episode is less than a page, but it certainly was creating headlines on both sides of the Atlantic. And what was at issue wasn't their decision to call the child, their daughter Lilibet. I mean, that the Queen was sort of, you know, as far as one can tell, I mean, was not unduly bothered by that. I mean, that wasn't the nub of it. The issue, what made her angry, was that them having decided to call their daughter Lilibet, they then let it be known that the Queen had given it her blessing.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Queen had not been asked. I mean, she'd been informed, and it was like, okay, that's what we're going to call the child. It was the fact that having having let it be known that the Queen had given it her blessing, when the BBC then reported that the Queen had not given it her blessing because she hadn't actually been asked, the Sussexes then did what the Sussexes often do, which is a reach for the lawyers, and immediately started threatening legal action and put Fleet Street on warning that anybody who said this would be sued. And the BBC stood by their guns. And when the Sussexes went to the palace to say, well, will you back up our version of events? It was a classic case of recollections may vary. And what made the Queen angry, as somebody I spoke to said, as angry as I'd ever seen her, was the fact that she was being asked to verify a version of events that was not the case, or certainly not as she remembered it. And one thing you don't do is you don't get the monarch to say 2 + 2 = 5.
Yeah. And did you get any personally get any comeback from across the pond about putting those details?
No, not personally. No, I didn't. No, I no. I mean, there was. I mean, as ever with anything to do with the sort of the Sussexes versus the Windsors. I mean, there's just it's such an incendiary issue. There's always sort of. I mean, social media went berserk. I mean, I'm not a very assiduous tweeter or whatever we call it now, X. I don't tweet that much. I don't really kind of get stuck into those things because you can spend days on end just sort of either it was being shouted at by both sides, and I don't find any of it very illuminating. I stand by what I wrote, and I've no reason to change it.
No, exactly. And how do you approach balancing historical accuracy with sort of engaging storytelling in your writing? Quite difficult.
You've got to get it right. The facts come first, and then you've got to write them in an interesting way. And I hope I have. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, the reviews, as ever on these things, there were some really nice reviews. There's there were a few what we call stinkers. Largely, they generally seem to be driven by the views of I mean those who were critical. I would say were pretty sort of critical of the whole kind of royal scene anyway. So it's fine. I mean, it's what you write books, you're going to get a few plaudits and a few brickbats. Overall, you just hope that the people who buy it like it. I hope they have. And also, there's now increasingly. And I've done a few books before, but I've noticed with this one, more and more people are listening to it rather than reading it. The audio version, and all my books I've read out myself for the audio version, and that's quite an interesting process in itself. I mean, you actually pick up by reading out your own work. You do find sort of spelling mistakes and literals, or you find a sort of sentence. Hang on, there are 2 relative clauses here. I mean, we need a full stop in here. And so I think by reading it out, you get a sense of how it flows. And I hope people feel that it does.
No, definitely. I think they definitely do. So moving on to Spare, I just wanted to ask you about this. I personally refuse to read it. But I don't know whether you've read it. Have you read it? Yeah.
Well, I've sort of read it twice in 2 different ways because of course it came out almost exactly a year before my own book, in January of 23, and it had a very tightly controlled, as all things to do with the Sussexes, the media management plan was incredibly carefully, strictly arranged so that it would come out globally on the same day, which from memory I think was I don't know. It was early mid-January, and then a few days before it was supposed to come out. And of course, I mean, the whole world, the whole media world, and I'm a journalist, we all desperate to see what's in it.
Yeah.
And then a very kind independent bookseller in Valencia, Spain, started selling it early. There was a holiday coming up, and anyway, he decided it would make a good holiday gift. So he was selling copies. So suddenly the Spanish edition hit the streets. I don't know, 3 or 4 days before it was supposed to come out. So instantly everybody wanted the Spanish edition translated. So I first read it in Spanish translation, which was interesting because I didn't quite get some of the nuances. Then I read it then in English. It's an extraordinary book. It's probably the most revealing, the most candid royal memoir I can recall reading.
Was it as shocking and damning as you thought it would be?
No, it wasn't. It was shocking, but not damning. It was shocking that a member of the family could just chuck in so many intimate conversations with family members, a lot of which were. As I say in my own book, I don't think any of the royal family emerge in a particularly grim light. I mean, the King Charles comes out as a sort of endearing, slightly eccentric, but a loving father. He doesn't really he's clearly loves his brother. I mean, obviously they've had terrible rows and whatever, but I mean, William and Kate come out, I think, looking as sympathetic figures. And I think the person who was probably not most worried about it before it came out was Queen Camilla, obviously. And actually, again, in there, I mean, there are parts of it where Harry is quite scathing. But at the same time, he acknowledges that she has been a force for good for his father. So it's not. I don't think it's as vituperative as I was expecting. But just the level of indiscretion. Here's someone who is constantly going on about how much he values his privacy, and he's just chucking out these very intimate chats with all lots of different members of the family, and I think it's a trust thing. People say, well, why can't the family just sort of extend a hand of friendship or whatever? I mean, I think there's a genuine concern now, as there has been for some time, that well, is there another book coming? If you have a chat, is it gonna end up in print? And I think until people feel that's not going to happen, it's quite hard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, are there any accounts in the two books? So you've got Spare, and then comparing it to your book, that really don't match up. If you
Not really, because I mean, my book really begins. There's not a lot on the Sussexes in there. I mean, there's a chapter I call Headwinds, where I look at the early media storms that did hit the king's reign. I mean, he'd only been king for a few weeks, and suddenly you get these the series of negative stories. You get a new series of The Crown coming out, which is very much that particular series 5 of The Crown, which came out just after he'd become king. That all concerned the breakdown of his marriage with Diana. So that's a sort of a huge distraction, if you like. And then in the middle of all that, suddenly also on Netflix, you had the trailers and pre-publicity starting for Harry and Meghan, followed by the first of, I mean, Harry and Meghan, a 6-part series by the couple. It's ostensibly a documentary, but I mean their company Archewell is on the production credits, so they're clearly involved in it, in making it as well as starring in it. And you've got all that coming out, and that's going up on into December, and then no sooner has that program run its course than you're into the pre-publicity for Harry's book Spare, and then all the interviews beforehand to do with Spare, and then Spare itself. So you've got about 12 weeks of non-stop media,
Frenzy.
Oh, I mean, I remember it. I remember sort of sitting up till whenever it was in the morning to watch the first episode of Harry and Meghan, because they came out at midnight or something. And yeah, I mean, every day, well, certainly every week, there was some sort of big story that the media would all of us in the media were waiting to see what will the King say, what will Prince William say about this. And time and again, the answer was nothing. They just got on with the job, and I've lost track of the number of comment pieces and articles and columns and editorials sort of saying it's time, the royal family must answer these questions, it's time for the King to speak, we must hear, and they just took a view, no, actually, this is private stuff. We're not going to be drawn on it. We're going to do show, not tell. We're going to just get on with our job. And what I found fascinating, well, it would have been obviously journalistically nice to have a bit of a response, but their strategy, I think, can be said to have worked, because when you look at the polling at the start of that period of, as I say, I call it sort of headwinds. You look at the polling in October 22, before it all kicks off, and then you look at the polling in mid-January 23 at the end of this, concerted series of adverse stories. Nothing's changed. The public have a very settled view. I think they know what the King is like. Most people are very happy to have a constitutional monarchy. There are, of course, those who don't want who want an elected head of state. That's fine. That's a perfectly respectable position in a democracy. But the point is that the polling just shows nothing moves. It's still the figures are the same at the beginning and the end.
And did your book? I mean, I'm guessing, probably a stupid question, did it have to get approved by King Charles and his aides before being published?
No, it's not an authorized. If you write an authorized biography, then obviously, by definition, that's something that they have a right of veto. But no, this was not authorized. So no, it didn't have to get past anybody. I mean, there were one or two people who had said they wanted to check their quotes. Which, when you're writing books, sometimes people ask for quote approval. That's sort of standard practice. But no, and that certainly did not apply to the palace. So no.
And do you know whether he's read it?
I don't. I mean, I sent a copy. I sent a couple of copies actually to the King and the Queen, and had a pleasant acknowledgement from. That they'd arrived, but no comment on the contents. So I don't know. And same with I've written a few royal books before. You don't get feedback, and I don't think you should either. Really, I mean, it's sort of. I mean, clearly, if something's badly wrong, then you might get a solicitor's letter.
Here. I'm sure you'd hear.
But yeah, you so I suppose in a sense you could say no news is good news. But I'm quite sure there are things in there that they would probably they would rather weren't there. But it's we live in an open democracy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in what ways do you hope the book will contribute to our understanding of Charles III and his place in history?
Well, I hope it will convey the way that this reign just got off to a very solid and prompt start. We obviously we got very little to compare it with in my case. I mean, I wasn't born when the last time the throne changed hands. you've got to be well over 70 to remember the last time. But I think looking as far as I can, looking at the files, and as I said, I mean, the king gave me access to the Royal Archives to look at the files on 1952, 53, the accession of Elizabeth II. And it was a much more leisurely process. I mean, that was in part because of it was just a different sort of society then, but it was also it was a real shock. I mean, Elizabeth II she was a 25-year-old mother of two when she became monarch. Charles III is the oldest new monarch in our history, and he's well into his 70s. I mean, previously it was William IV was the last, as it were, elderly newcomer to the throne, and he was in his early 60s. So there's an element of urgency there, but I hope the book conveys the way that this reign began, at pace.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just because you've got an old king who thinks, well, I haven't got long to make my mark, I want to get on with it. I mean, I dare say that may have been part of his thinking, but I think there's also a sense that, and as I say this in the book, and one or two people make this point, that he's the first monarch who can't rely on a nation just assuming and accepting the monarchy. It's got to justify itself. It's got to stay relevant. He's got to, he and the family have to constantly sort of remind a generally supportive but nonetheless sort of skeptical society of why they're there, and that's something that he has to do, and that doesn't give you any room to sort of it doesn't give you much of a honeymoon period, put it that way. It was a very short honeymoon period, whereas I mean with Elizabeth II, I think the first time her subjects heard her voice as monarch was over 10 months after she came to the throne, whereas with Charles III it was within 24 hours.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Can you just tell us, when will the book come out in paperback?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Oh, okay.
Probably not this side of Christmas, anyway.
Okay, fine.
It will be a hardback all this year.
Yeah.
And it will be updated at some point. I think it stands as it is, as it says on the cover. It's the inside story of how our king became king.
Brilliant. Well, I've looked through as much of it as I could before we spoke, but I'm looking forward to reading it properly over the next week or two. Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you, Panda.
Very kind.